Now, I would like to speak about some important critics who practiced deconstruction. So, that means now from Derrida's theory to actual deconstructive criticism. And what happens when a critic uses deconstruction? How does his essay or his book read? What are the strategies that a critic follows when he employs deconstruction in his approach or in his study of something? So that is our main focus here right now. You know that especially in the United States of America, Jacques Derrida had a very important, very seminal influence. That means many important American critics were simply won over by Jacques Derrida. And you know that before Jacques Derrida appeared on the scene, American academy was dominated by new criticism, and some critics also use Marxism. But when Derrida's ideas appeared on the scene, suddenly number of critics were won over by his ideas. And there one university especially became a very important center of deconstructive theory. Which is that university? It was Yale University. Which is that university? Yale University. And it is interesting to make this observation that another approach which developed later, a bit later, that was New Historicism, cultural materialism. Now, New Historicism had another center, say Berkeley, California, and where it was a kind of rival center to Yale University. That means not only in their approach, but also in a sort of, say, rivalry which you can see probably in the academic world. So there, Berkeley, California would become a kind of center of historicism. So who were the important people in Yale University who practiced deconstruction? Jacques Derrida himself spent some time at Yale University. But it was Paul Deman, who was a very important critic in Yale University. And apart from Paul Deman, there was Jeffrey Hartman. Jeffrey Hartman. There was Hillis Miller, and Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom. Paul Deman, Jeffrey Hartman, Hillis Miller, and Harold Bloom. These four important names who are identified with deconstructive criticism. Now, here I must make, say, a slight observation about Harold Bloom. He practiced deconstructive theory, but he differed from his peers in number of different ways because he also considered literature as very special use of language, and he also championed the canon, the Western canon. So, if we talk about Harold Bloom, then we must talk about Harold Bloom with some qualifications, right? Now, these four important names, and there is also a kind of term which is used to describe these four important critics. And what is that term? This is not a very complimentary term. This is used by others. Hermeneutic mafia. Hermeneutic mafia. So you understand something through this, say, funny title also. Sometimes you learn something through these funny titles also, right? So hermeneutic, we have understood hermeneutics. We have talked about hermeneutics. Hermeneutic. It refers to interpretation. It refers to interpretation of text. It refers to understanding of text. Hermeneutic. And hermeneutic mafia. Mafia is always somebody who is important and who has a very threatening kind of presence. So hermeneutic mafia. Okay. We begin with Paul Deman. And Paul Deman has two very important books. One important book was Blindness and Insight, and the other important book was Allegories of Reading. Now, what is the title of this book saying? Blindness and Insight. Paul Deman is talking about new criticism, and he says that often critics achieve a kind of insight in their moment of blindness. That means when they are blind to something, paradoxically, at that moment, they also achieve a certain insight. When they are blind to certain things, at that time, they also achieve a certain insight, a certain understanding. How to explain this? And here he gives the example of new criticism. And if you look at the work of new critics, you'll know that their idea of criticism, their idea of a poem is based on Coleridge's notion of organic form. Coleridge. And Coleridge was a very important name. So what is this idea of organic form? Coleridge is saying that in the natural world, there is a certain form. And similarly, a poem also has a certain form. And a poem has a certain unity. That means there may be very different elements in a poem, different devices used in a poem, different kinds of, say, literary devices like irony, like metaphor, like tension, like texture. These are important terms like ambiguity. Most of these elements can be found in the work of new criticism. But what is important here is that all these different elements ultimately contribute to the idea of unity in a text. A text is a unified whole, and all these different elements contribute to the idea of unity in unity to a work. Paul Newman is saying that actually when new critics work on these principles and what they see is ambiguity in a work. So a poem is using the device of ambiguity, and ambiguity means that a word does not mean what it appears to say, that it has multiple meanings which cannot be tied by the use of that word even in a particular context. So that element of ambiguity is very much there, and new critics are focusing on that element of ambiguity. Similarly, there may be other words in a poem which may say something which is very different from what they appear to be saying, right? But at the end, new critics try to find unity through those disparate elements. Now, what is the insight which is gained here? Paul Deman is saying actually the unity is not in the poem. New critics start with this assumption that the poem has that unity and all those different elements contribute to unity in that poem. But what Paul Deman is saying that poem does not have that element of unity. Rather, the element of unity is in the act of interpretation. That means when critics interpret something, the unity lies in their interpretation, not in the poem. The poem is saying so many different things, and if there is use of ambiguity in a poem, or there is use of metaphorical language in a poem, or there is use of irony in a poem, use of paradox in a poem, then probably all those things are saying different things. So new critics have understood this important aspect, that a poem may have different elements, and all these different elements may be saying something very different. So what is this insight? Plural nature of poetry. What is this insight? A word cannot be tied to its meanings. What is this insight? That a metaphor or a literary device makes meaning unstable. And where is that insight coming from? The insight is coming from a moment of blindness, because new critics are not looking at this plural nature of those things. They are looking at the concept of unity. So in the act of discovering unity, they discover plural nature of those words, those devices, and all possible elements which can mean different things, and where what is said is very different from what appears on the surface. I hope you understood this point. So blindness in insight. Insight comes. What is this insight? Plural nature of language. What is this insight? Slippery nature of language. And what is this blindness? Because critics were interested in simply the concept of unity. So the concept of unity is there, but this concept of unity exists in the act of interpretation and not in a poem. This is one important aspect of Paul de Man's work. Now, you know that many important critics who use deconstruction, they were experts of romantic poetry. Romantic poetry. Many of those experts, say, even Paul de Man, say, for example, was an expert of romantic poetry. And if you see romantic poetry, there is one element in romantic poetry. Romantic poets are always looking for those spots of time. That is Wordsworth's concept, spots of time. They are also looking for those epiphanies. Epiphany is a term which you have, say, encountered in our discussion of James Joyce. That means they are always looking for those spots of time, those moments which reveal something very important, which reveal some insights about life. But somehow those moments prove to be illusory. Those moments are not there. And those moments are always in the past or maybe in future, but those moments are not there in the present. Somehow what you see, instead of presence, you have that absence of those moments. So those spots of time, those epiphanies which romantic poets are trying to discover, they are not there in the present. And what is there in the present? Absence absence So in a way, romantic poetry lends itself beautifully to deconstructive readings, where that absence is very much there, and where absence of those spots of time, absence of those epiphanies in the present is lamented. The other work of Paul de Man, we are talking about Paul de Man, is Allegories of Reading. Allegories of Reading. Now, this is also very important work, because it started what is called rhetorical type of deconstruction, right? Rhetorical type of deconstruction. And here it is important to know that Paul de Man was influenced by Jacques Derrida, but Paul de Man also developed many of these ideas independently. So what is this rhetorical type of deconstruction? Rhetorical type of deconstruction focuses on the slippery nature of language, right? So there is that referential function of language, and there is also the figurative function of language. This is the traditional distinction which is followed. What is figurative and what is referential? We say that poetry uses figurative language, and we say that in science the language that is used is referential. That means language is used simply for the sake of information, giving information and receiving information, referential language. We have also studied Roman Jakobson's functions, where Roman Jakobson talked about, say, poetic function of language, where words are important for their own sake, for their own sound, for their own rhythm, for their own, say, beauty. On the other hand, in referential uses of language, information is important. So if I say that, are you going there? It means I'm asking you a question, are you going there? So that is the referential function of language. And in our, say, day-to-day language also, we make a distinction between figurative language and referential language. But Paul Deman is making this point, and this is an important point. This is something which is at the very heart of deconstructive theory, that this distinction between referential and figurative cannot hold. This distinction between figurative and referential cannot hold. Rather, even in referential uses of language, the figural aspect of language is somehow hidden. That means that figurative aspect of language never goes away. It is always there. It never disappears. It is very much there. And this means that language and is language always uses tropes. Tropes means all those figures, all those figures. And no language is free from those tropes. And what we can see here is that there is some similarity between his views and Nietzsche's views, right? Nietzsche also talked about, say, this particular concept that, say, figurative language never goes away. Now, this leads us to a rhetorical kind of deconstruction. So, a simple question, for example, and this comes from Paul Deman: tea or coffee? Tea or coffee? And the answer is, what's the difference? Tea or coffee? What's the difference? Now, what's the difference? Here, it has this referential meaning, maybe, that is there any difference between tea and coffee, whether I have tea or coffee? Is there any difference whether I have tea or coffee? Right? What's the difference? But it can be understood differently also. What's the difference between tea and coffee? So that figurative aspect never disappears. And if we see the work of Paul Deman, then you'll realize that he's talking about impossibility of any correct reading because of the figurative aspect of language, because figures never go away. So there cannot be any reading which can be a correct reading. And so he advances the concept of misreading. Misreading. Misreading means that we cannot read a text completely because we cannot discover the intention, we cannot discover the context, we cannot eliminate the elements of ambiguity in the text, and that figural aspect of text never goes away. But what you have instead, you have misreadings. But he makes a distinction between two different kinds of misreadings. One is a correct misreading, and the other is incorrect misreading. That means correct misreading is one, where the critic acknowledges and leaves the possibility of more misreadings. So if I select a poem by Wordsworth and I read that and I interpret that and I focus on those words and I focus on the slippery nature of language in that text, then this is my reading, but in Demand's language it is misreading. But I am not, say, eliminating the possibility of future misreadings, and that's why my misreading is correct misreading. On the other hand, if I give this impression that no other reading is possible, then this is incorrect misreading. So from reading, you have the concept of misreading. And please do not think that misreading means bad reading. Misreading is also a form of interpretation. And misreading here in Paul Demand's language talks about an interpretation of a work where it cannot decide what it is saying, where those movements of aporia is important in the text. So that is demands focus on figurative language and how our language never eliminates the possibility of figures, tropes, which are everywhere, right? And so when we talk about the nature of language, we cannot make a proper distinction between figurative language and literal language. Literal language also has that figurative element, and which can be seen in day-to-day conversation and which can also be seen elsewhere. But important thing about a literary work is that a literary work does not hide this fact that it uses figurative language. So in one way, literary discourse is superior to other discourses because it is not hiding this fact of its figural dimension. So from here, we learn this idea that all texts actually are self-deconstructing. There was a discussion at the beginning that deconstruction is not destruction. So all texts are self-deconstructing. That means in a text, you'll always find that a logical element, one particular, say, element which can be used to deconstruct that text. All texts are self-collapsing, self-deconstructing. And we'll see this when we read one essay by J. Hillis Miller. So this is the Paul Demand. And you see that this concept of misreading is not simply confined to literary critics. Even a very important post-structuralist historian has used deconstructive terminology and deconstructive theory in his approach. This historian is Hayden White. Hayden White. And what Hayden White does is, Hayden White reads the work of some historians. And what he identifies in those works is the use of tropes. Usually it is believed that historians' work is free from those tropes and those figures. Rather, they are using referential language. But Hayden White finds four important tropes in the work of historians. And what are those four important tropes? There is the use of metaphor, there is the use of metonymy, there is the use of synecdoche, and there is the use of irony. So metaphor,
Sir,
metonymy,
can you tell the name of the author again, please?
Hayden
Who
White,
gave these?
Hayden White, Hayden White. Hayden White is the name of the
Okay, sir.
historian, and he has especially offered a deconstructive reading of Freud, of Marx, and British historian E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson. So the point was that use of figures or use of tropes is not simply confined to literary works. It can also be seen elsewhere. And here we gave the example of Hayden White, who talks about E.P. Thompson, who talks about Marx and Freud, and where he tries to show that their work also depends on tropes. And what are those four important tropes? Metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. Right. Now later we'll see that especially in post-structuralist theory, this distinction between literary and non-literary is also not maintained. And we have already seen in structuralist theory, where structuralist insights or structuralist theory could be used not only to works of literature, but also to all, all other works, right? So gradually this blurring of boundaries is also taking place. And here Hayden White talking about use of figures in the work of historians is an important, say, example. So Paul Deman, Hayden White, but we are talking about the group of Yale deconstructionists. And another very important name here is that of Harold Bloom. Harold Bloom died, I think, in 2018. A very important name. And Harold Bloom was many things actually in one person. He was a Shakespeare scholar. He was also a scholar of, say, theory, and he also studied Blake. And one is just baffled to see the amount of work that Harold Bloom has produced. So Harold Bloom also talks about tropes. But here I must make a distinction between Harold Bloom's criticism and the criticism of other important deconstructionist critics. As I said at the beginning of this talk, Harold Bloom shares some ground with his peers, but he has also written a book in defense of the Western canon. That this is the Western canon. These are the important writers. These are the important writers who should be studied. These are the important texts which should be studied. Now, in post-structuralist theory, usually the concept of canon is demolished. No canon whatsoever. And that is one reason why you are studying so many, say, different writers from different places, not only British writers. So Harold Bloom talking about Western canon, this is something which is very unlike a post-structuralist critic. And then Harold Bloom also talks about literature using a very special kind of language. He also talks about the special status of literature. So that means this is another, say, stance which is very unlike that of a post-structuralist critic, right? And similarly, Harold Bloom also talks about Shakespeare, and it's a beautiful book where he talks about, but very debatable, where he talks about the invention of the human. That means human beings have been formed, and how, say, Shakespeare has been responsible, say, in a very big way, say, for the formation of human nature. That means invention of the human. That is a very interesting title of his book on Shakespeare. So Harold Bloom is many things in one person. But here, and of course, he was also interested in philosophy. He was also interested in religion, in mysticism, and especially, say, what is called Kabbal mysticism. That means ancient Jewish text, Kabbal mysticism, or Kabbalistic mysticism. That is the term. Harold Bloom also talked about tropes, but he has a very different kind of theory. And what is that theory? The theory is basically derived from his reading of Freud, his reading of Freud, his reading of tropes, and his reading of Kabbalistic tradition, Kabbalistic mysticism. Now, what is this theory? You know that Freud talks about Oedipus complex. And here Bloom talks about a poet writing something, but at the same time, the poet feels kind of anxiety of influence. This is his term, anxiety of influence. And this is his theory also, anxiety of influence. What is this anxiety of influence? I'm writing something. I'm writing a poem. I'm writing a poem on nature. But somehow I also feel anxious about the fact that many of these romantic poets have written, say, poems about nature. I feel this anxiety. Okay, I think about writing a play about, say, a particular subject, but then I feel this anxiety that, okay, somebody else has written that play, or there are plays on this particular theme. Now, a poet has this feeling of belatedness. That means whatever he wants to say, whatever theme he wants to explore, that has already been explored by somebody. And Harold Bloom talks about this anxiety of influence from the period of Milton onwards. And he's talking here in terms of, or his frame of reference is English literature. So from the period of Milton onwards, many poets started feeling this anxiety of influence. They started feeling their belatedness. They became conscious of their belatedness. Now what is this? That they have come late. Already this theme has been explored. Already a lot has been said about this. Already somebody has written a poem about this. So this is the awareness of a poet, awareness of his belatedness. Now what does he do? And here Harold Bloom talks about the work of one important 16th century writer, Isaac Luria. And he talked about Kabbalistic mysticism. Bloom says that his work reveals three important stages. How a particular poet responds to his belatedness. And what are those three stages? One stage is limitation, and then substitution, and then representation. Limitation, substitution, and representation. Limitation is where I have a new look at something. So if I'm writing a poem, I have a new look at the nature poems of Wordsworth. I have a new look. And then I substitute that thing with something else. First, I have a new look, and then I substitute that thing with something else. But then, third stage, representation, I try to restore that meaning, but differently. So here I have engaged with the work of a predecessor poet. I have engaged with a predecessor, and my work has followed three stages. First stage is I have a new look at that thing. That is limitation. Second stage is I try to replace that thing with something else. That is substitution. And the third stage is representation, when I restore that meaning but differently. So here I become conscious of my belatedness and I try to make sense of this belatedness. Now this can be seen further in another important work that Harold Bloom wrote, and this work was titled A Map of Misreading. And in this work, A Map of Misreading, he talks about the concept of revisionary ratios, right? Revisionary ratios. I'll take 5 more minutes. Maybe today Zoom is not giving say any say signal, right? Okay, so what is this idea of revisionary ratios? And here Bloom says that there are 6 important strategies, 6 important strategies which a poet uses in order to engage with his belatedness. In order to engage with his belatedness. And what are those important strategies? Say irony, synecdoche, metonymy, hyperbole, I'm sorry, and metaphor and metalepsis. Probably you understand all these terms. You understand irony, you understand synecdoche, you understand metonymy, you understand hyperbole, you understand metaphor, but maybe you do not understand metalepsis. So metalepsis means where a figurative meaning is used very differently in a new context. So there is, if I use this sentence that from today onwards, I am going to follow the philosophy of slow and steady. I am going to follow the philosophy of slow and steady. Are you reminded of something? Slow and steady wins the race. Now, this is the metaphorical meaning there. But I use that in a different sentence. So I took those words from that expression, that saying, that proverb, and I use this, say, in a matter of fact manner. I'm going to follow the philosophy of slow and steady. Right. So, or you can make other examples also. Okay, the white elephant has been disposed of today. The white elephant has been disposed of today. Now, white elephant is an expression, is a metaphor. But when I say that white elephant has been disposed of today, so I am using it in a different context now. That is metalepsis. And a poet who comes later, who has this awareness of his belatedness, he tries to engage with his predecessor in all these different ways. He uses the device of irony when he engages with the work of his predecessor, or synecdoche, or metonymy, or hyperbole, or say metaphor or metalepsis. And Bloom also gives the example of some, say, crisis poems written during the Romantic period. Say, for example, somebody like Shelley, Wordsworth, Keats, and of course Tennyson also, they were writing certain poems, and how some of these poets were conscious of the work of other poets. And when they were conscious of the work of other poets, they were trying to engage with those other poets differently. One can see the example of Ode to the West Wind and Immortality Ode. Immortality Ode. So it is not simply a question of influence or echo. It is also a question of, say, trying to grapple with your awareness of your belatedness. So if Shelley is writing and Wordsworth has already tackled that theme, Shelley feels that sense of belatedness, and he tries to engage with say his work in all these different ways. So what is important about Harold Bloom? Harold Bloom talks about anxiety of influence. Harold Bloom talks about this kind of misprison. Harold Bloom talks about misreading, right? Harold Bloom talks about those revisionary ratios. Harold Bloom takes his example from, say, Kabbalistic mysticism. And Harold Bloom also applies that to Romantic poetry. And Harold Bloom talks about all these examples since the time of Milton, when many of these poets started feeling a sense of their relatedness. I think I'll stop at this particular point. Maybe I can hear something from you.